Okay, we're ready to go, and I now get to introduce our speaker. I get to introduce you to Jane Simon Ammeson, who's a busy, award-winning, Michigan-based freelance writer who has authored, is it 16 books?
It may be 17. I'm not sure.
Okay. Covering travel, historic places, food, and true crime throughout Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. She also reviews books for the New York Journal of Books, and she writes a book review column called Shelf Life for the Times of Northwest Indiana. And so today, Jane is going to tell us about her fascinating journey into true crime after her mother told her about a family link to a decades-old, highly sensational Indiana murder. And this book, published in 2015, is the result. Jane had been planning to join us in person today, but due to circumstances beyond her control, she decided it would be best to Zoom in from her home in Stevensville, Michigan. Is that right?
That is right.
Okay, and I'm hoping that we can get her to visit us in person in the not too distant future.
Definitely. It's a nice group. What a fun group.
Well, we are really. And now it is my pleasure to turn the spotlight over to Jane Simon Ammeson. Take it away.
Okay, thanks. Little background. I'm a Hoosier by birth and by choice too, even though I live in Michigan. I am from Northwest Indiana, steel mill city called East Chicago, Indiana. And so a lot of times when people think of Michigan, they think of Detroit, but I'm 70 miles outside of Chicago. So that is my major city. But I love Indiana, and I think it's often an overlooked gem of a place with lots of historic cities and interests and a lot of true crime too. So, hey, I write a lot of magazine and newspaper articles, and now I'm doing blogging too. But about, oh my goodness, around 2010 or so, my mother, who was 95 at the time, said, well, I need to tell you some things because I'm getting old. Of course, my thought was, Mom, you're 95, you are old, but it was a good way to look at it, I think, on her part. She mentioned that she had been pinned to a man named Bernie Hurst, who lived in our town too, East Chicago, Indiana, and that they both were going to Indiana University at the time. This would have been in the early 1930s. Her father, who was always working even during the Depression, everybody was low on money, so he pulled her out of college because girls didn't need an education anyway. According to him, he was a good, staunch German, and he had 2 sons in college. So I think she was very hopeful that Bernie Hurst would marry her, but he ultimately told her that he couldn't because she wasn't Jewish. And she had kept his, what do they call that when they pin you when you're in a fraternity? A lavalier or something. And she was kind of looking for it. And I was like surprised because Bernie Hurst was my elementary school principal. And then she mentioned his mother had been murdered. And I'm like, Bernie Hurst's mother murdered. And so I did some digging. And this was before all the newspapers were online like they are now. And she couldn't remember their last name. She said it was something like Hershkovitz or Herskovitz or whatever, but they changed it after the murder. Finally, the Lake County Public Library found like tons and tons of newspapers, and I started reading them, and it was fascinating. It turns out that Mr. Hurst's mother was a pharmacist, which was very unusual back in 1907 when she earned her degree from Columbia College. Of like 900 graduates, only 7 of them were women. And she had married, or I came to find out she'd married either 4 or 5 times, but her last husband was considerably younger than her, very handsome. His name was Harry Diamond, which is a perfect name for a villain. And he was a bootlegger. And he also dealt in stolen diamonds and things like that. And he murdered her and tried to blame it. Well, he shot her, tried to blame it on the black chauffeur, but the black chauffeur, whose name was Armstrong, William Armstrong, managed to get away, got a ride, went to the police station. In the meantime, Harry drove to one of her pharmacies instead of taking her to the hospital, and laid her on the floor. She had played dead. And as soon as he laid her on the floor, she said very loudly to everyone who was in there, "You murdered me, Harry." And he kept saying, "No, tell them that the chauffeur did it." Now, why he would think she would do him any favors at that point, I don't know. But anyway, yeah. Oh, sure, Harry. So anyway, the police arrived, they arrest Harry. They take Nettie, Diamond was her name at the time, to the hospital in Gary, Indiana. At the time in Chicago didn't have one. And she managed to give a statement to the police, and then she turned to her best friend who was by her side and said, "Anna, I can't go on." And she died. Harry was convicted. He was the first Jewish man or person to be executed in the electric chair in Indiana. And it was a fascinating story. I mean, a horrific story. And it turned out that there were so many people in my life besides my mother that were peripherally connected to the murder. My favorite teacher, my fourth grade teacher, was best friends, was the granddaughter, sorry, of Nettie's best friend, the one she said, "I can't go on any longer, Anna." And I had actually done some work for Bernie Hearst's brother, who was an attorney who owned an insurance company. I mean, so there are all these connections about a case, but no one had talked about the case forever. And so it was lost history, and it was just fascinating. So I queried the history press. They said, "Go ahead." And then I tend to dig too deep into research. I'm like a geek. And finally, my publisher's going, "Jane, where's the book?" And one of my best friends who was an author said, "Jane, quit researching, just write the book." So anyway, that was my first foray into true crime. Since then, I've written a lot of other books. And the one I have up here is kind of fascinating. Has anybody ever heard of Bill Gunnis? Okay, I don't hear anybody talking.
Bill Gunnis.
Oh,
Bill
yes.
Gunnis lived in LaPorte, Indiana. And she was originally from Norway. She had lived in Chicago before moving to LaPorte and buying a 43-acre farm. At the time Bill Gunnis was operating, she was a pretty serious serial killer. There were two other serial killers operating out of Chicago. One you're probably familiar with, H.H. Holmes, Double in the White City, if you've read Eric Larson's book about that case. And the other was a Johann Hoch, who was German and specialized in marrying German women who lived in the United States and murdering them. And then there was Bell. Of those three, both Holmes and Hoch ended up getting caught and were hung. Bell was never caught. She probably made millions of dollars. She was quite the entrepreneur. She was a horrible person, but quite the entrepreneur. She not only would seduce, I guess would be the word, these lonely Norwegian farmers who are living like in North Dakota or whatever, get them to give her their money, and then she would murder them, chop them up, cover them with quicklime, and bury them on her 43 acres. But she also had some connections with the mob. And, if you murder somebody in Chicago, you have the problem of where to put the body. Well, she had a solution to that. Ship it to her in trunks, and she would bury it. So she made money that way. She also performed abortions for mobsters' girlfriends. And sometimes she lost a patient or two. And she also adopted children. And this is, everything is horrible. This is really horrible. At the time, orphanages were teeming with abandoned children, and they would pay you to take children off their hands, like give you $100, which was a significant amount of money. And she would adopt these children. And then her neighbors started saying, "Well, what happened to this little girl that was here? Or what happened to that little boy?" Anyway, a lot of children in her care died, including her biological children and one adopted child that she'd have lived with her for 16 years. And when they found her body on the property too, when they finally looked, figured out what was going on. Her whole scheme fell apart when a determined Norwegian man whose brother Andrew had gone to Bell's and then disappeared. And he came and started searching for her, tried to talk to the sheriff who was in the cahoots with Bell, and looked at the property, trying to figure out where his brother was starting to leave, walking up the road to go back to the train station, and thought, I just can't leave Andrew here. I know he's here. Went back, asked the right question of the workers. Have you dug any holes, around April, which is when Andrew disappeared? They said, oh yeah, we did. We dug a hole for Bell to put garbage in. They went and they dug up Andrew. And then the whole scheme fell apart. Bell, in the meantime, set fire to her house, killing her 3 children. And they found another body there, a woman without a head. And it was assumed that it was Bell, but the body size was all wrong. And there are a lot of forensics here, but what was I going to say? Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Heads burn at a higher temperature than the house fire would burn. So there was no way there shouldn't be a head. Oh, and so they started digging around the property. They discovered all these bodies, but what she'd done is she dismembered them and put, one part of the body here, one part of the body there. So there are all these bins, and I'm going to show this to you. This is kind of gross. Well, here's Andrew. Oops. They put all the bodies in bins. So you'd have a bin of legs, and you'd have a bin of arms, and you'd have a bin of all sorts of things. And I'm not doing a good job here of finding them, but this is Andrew after he was dug up. And here are the bins. Oh. So anyway, she got away and nobody knows whatever happened to her. There were sightings over the years, but it was a fascinating story. And just I did it because my editor had asked me to. It's not the kind of murder things I like. I have written historic novel, or not novels, but books about, women who are very beautiful, who put poison in the tea of their husbands and then remarry and put poison in the tea of their next husband. But Belle was quite a character. So fascinating story, lots of ins and outs in terms of who knew what and how she got away with it for so long, because all the neighbors knew these people were disappearing, and all their relatives would show up and say, where's Harry? Where's Henry? Where's Olaf? So that was fun. And my award-winning book, it was on Abraham Lincoln. And that was fascinating too. It won the Lowell Thomas Journalism Award, 3rd place, travel book. But I was looking at Lincoln sites that you could still go to today that aren't the major ones, not like Springfield or whatever, but small ones. Like there's a restaurant in southern Indiana outside of Evansville, called the Log Inn. It opened in 1827. It's never closed. It was a stagecoach stop, and Lincoln stopped there in 1846 when he was campaigning for Henry Clay. You can go eat there in the same room that Abraham Lincoln ate in. And it's just fascinating. And that's what I looked at, places that you could touch that are real, whether it's a hotel that Lincoln stayed at, or a place he visited, like Henry Clay's place in Lexington, or obviously Mary Todd Lincoln's home in Lexington. You get that physical connection to Lincoln, which I think is just, to me as a history buff, is fascinating. And I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but Kentucky claims Lincoln and Illinois claims Lincoln, but Lincoln spent his formative years in Indiana from age 7 to 21. And so there's so much history in Spencer County that is Lincoln oriented, which is fascinating. And there are families there by fifth, sixth generation that when you read histories of Lincoln, their ancestors interacted with him. And of course, there are a lot of Lincolns. Lincoln's older brother, Josiah, lived in southeast Indiana, and he had lots of children, and his children had lots of children, and on and on. I have a friend who I call a double Lincoln because both on her mother's side and her father's side, they're related to Josiah. And the Lincolns interacted with the Boones, and they intermarried with the Boones. And so Squire Boone, who was Daniel's brother, settled in southeastern, sorry, my voice is going again, in southeastern Indiana, in Muckport. And you can go visit a cave that he's discovered when he was running away from Native Americans, that has like 1 million gallons of water going through it a day. And Lincoln's family supposedly visited, not Squire Boone's place, but that section of Indiana at one point visiting Josiah. So it's just all this connection is, to me, is what history and writing are about and what makes Indiana so special. And I think I'm going over my time limit, but I'm going to mention that when researching Lincoln, I discovered some interesting and rather salacious facts. Nancy Lincoln, we really knew for sure who her father was. Her sister Polly had 6 illegitimate children. You know, people lived like, you could have a single room log cabin and you might have 18 relatives living with you. So I don't know how they exactly did all this, but Daniel Boone disappeared for a couple of years. He was captured by Native Americans. When he came home, his wife Rebecca had a baby, Jemima, by his brother, who was married to Rebecca's sister, Martha. So, I mean, things were kind of loosey-goosey there. And then Daniel went out hunting one day with Eddie, that was his brother. They called him Nettie, really. And came back and said Nettie had been shot by Native Americans. And it makes you wonder if that really happened or whether Daniel got his revenge. But he raised Jemima as his own daughter, and that was great. But it just, I love how history is full of those little fascinating facts. And one other thing that always impressed me is Abraham Lincoln's grandfather was named Abraham Lincoln, and he is buried in Kentucky. He had 3 boys, he had a couple girls too, and he was working some land. They had followed the Boones to Kentucky, and he was shot and killed by a Native American. And about an equal number American or Caucasians killed a lot of Native Americans reciprocated. Anyway, the 3 little boys, one was Mordecai, he was 12. He ran into the cabin and got a gun, shot the Native American through a chink in the log cabin. The other son ran to get help, and Thomas, who was Lincoln's father, was 5 years old and just fell to the ground and was crying, you know, as most kids would. We often hear that Lincoln came from really rough stock. And it's true, Thomas didn't have much money. They lost a lot of land in bad land deals in Kentucky. They worked really hard. But the grandfather came from, you know, a fairly successful family. And Mordecai, under the rules of primogeniture, inherited all the property. So that's one reason why, you know, the Lincolns were so, Abraham Lincoln's family was so poor, but and they were pioneers. Southern Indiana was like full of panthers and all sorts of horrible things. But they really weren't as, no, I don't know, squirrely as, you know, a lot of people portray. So that was interesting to find out too. Anyway, I think I've gone on long enough, but does anybody have any questions for me? Oh, I know. I wanted to say one other thing. I did co-write a book with, oops, can we see it? Pat Koch, who is the owner or was the owner of Holiday World, and she and her husband founded it, grew it. And if anybody's interested in what Indiana was like in the 1930s in these small German Catholic towns, it's a fascinating read. It's probably at the library. You can always order it too. All the proceeds, I ghost wrote it, so I don't make any money on it now. But Mrs. Cook self-published it. It's sold like already 15,000 copies, which is a lot of copies. She donates all that money to this museum she's founded in southern Indiana, in Santa Claus, Indiana. But it is fascinating because there were still medicine men, and you'd put your shoes aside in the summer and not put them on again unless you were going to church. And the schools, even though they were public, were taught by nuns, and you took a break during the day to go to mass during school hours. So there was no differentiation between church and state, at least in southern Indiana. And anyway, any questions for me? No?
I have a question. I just really like to know, you've uncovered some really fascinating details about the history of Lincoln, and I've been personally a student of history and always looking for those facts that will reveal things we didn't know before. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of research and the kind of documents you looked at and what it kind of took to really kind of dig that deeply into the subject matter? Because that is so fascinating to me.
It is fascinating. Like I said, I go down rabbit holes like crazy. I do a lot of archival searches, like in small towns and stuff, because not everything is online. I mean, so much is online, but there's tons that isn't online. You know, like I found this Collier magazine article written in 1920. That's that I found online, but it had all this Lincoln information, you know, about Thomas Lincoln, and was written by a fairly famous person. Well, he was a writer for Collier's, which was a huge magazine back then. And he'd gone traveling and ended up in the mountains in Missouri or someplace, I can't remember where now, and I can send you the link and if you would like, and talk to a family member of the Lincolns that had all this gossipy information. And I talked to, you know, there's some really famous Lincoln writers, and they're like, God, we didn't know about this. And, you know, it was just, you just dig and you read one thing and you jump on it to the next. A lot of times you go down rabbit holes and they don't really lead anywhere. But a lot of times you find out just amazing information. Like I wrote a book called Murders That Made Headlines, Crimes of Indiana. And it's maybe 8 or 9 murders that took place in Indiana, again, back in the 1800s. And one thing I found, you know, abortion is obviously a huge controversial issue, but even back then, there were doctors who would advertise that they would restore menses, and meaning that they would restore your menstruation, which meant that they would get rid of what was interfering with you menstruating, which was having a baby. And they would advertise that. And you know, obviously it was a code word or something. But another thing I found out with that book was that a lot of men got rid of their girlfriends because they didn't want to have to marry them when they got pregnant, you know, which is pretty awful. Which leads me to Pearl Bryant. Has anybody ever heard of her? She was from Greencastle, which is where my dad went to undergrad. Greencastle, Indiana. But anyway, she got pregnant by a dental student, went down to Cincinnati to confront him. He ended up chopping off her head. They never did find the head. And the way she was identified was because a shoe salesman read about the shoe they found where her body was discovered and recognized it. And at the time, they just started using a French technique of shoe sizing and everything. And because they knew she was from Greencastle, they figured out it was her. No, they hadn't figured out it was her body yet. But he knew where all the shoes that, like the ones she was wearing, were. And they contacted the shoe shop in Greencastle. And the guy said, oh yeah, I sold that size to Pearl Bryant. And by then her family was looking for her and just frantic. And so because of this shoe salesman and because of the French sizing, they were able to trace her to Cincinnati, and then discovered that she'd been murdered by the steno student who impregnated her and then his friend, and they both were hung. So anyway, and she's buried in Greencastle, but without her head. Her parents really wanted to find her head. Yeah. So, but anyway, I read a lot of old newspapers, just a ton of old newspapers. I find myself on beautiful days sitting in some kind of dusty archive in some little town, and just happy to be there. One thing I discovered was a series of Ku Klux Klan. It was huge back in the 1920s in Chicago, in Indiana. And I found all these old photos of Ku Klux Klan people like surrounding a cemetery where somebody was being buried. I mean, and I did a story on the Grand Dragon who lived in Irvington at the time and murdered a young woman named Madge Overholster. And that was how they brought down the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana. So fascinating. Yeah, just you dig and you dig, and sometimes somebody has to say, Jane, just write the book, because you can't dig forever. But sometimes I even go back and keep digging because there's always something new online. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, how do you discipline yourself to cut off the research?
It's hard.
I used to have that same problem. I was a reporter and an investigative reporter, and
Oh, really?
I'd be digging forever if I didn't have an editor pull me back.
I know. I would be too. You know, the editors can be a pain in the rear end, but they're right. You need to stop digging sometimes. But you know, it's so tantalizing, and you want to put all this great stuff in your story because it tells you so much about the time and place. I mean, like this William Armstrong, the black chauffeur who escaped. I mean, if he hadn't been, if this wasn't Northwestern Indiana, which at the time was fighting the Klan, the local newspaper, the Northwest Indiana Times, that I actually write for, was receiving death threats because they were anti-Klan and stuff like that. In some of those other counties in Indiana, they probably would have lynched him. I mean, they were still lynching people up in, maybe not 1920s, but, you know, and newspapers would talk about lynching like it was like okay to do. And there's still some of my mysteries, I say mysteries, that I wrote about that I still don't know the answers to. And so every once in a while, I mean, I know the case and the outcome and stuff, but there's still some details. And so I like to go back. There are mysteries still that I find fascinating. And a lot of times the newspaper trail will end for some reason. So what you have to hope is that they'll keep putting more stuff online. Oh, and one fun thing is people sometimes write to me too. I did a story about this this woman in Indianapolis. She was like the housemaid for this family, wealthy German family, and she had a crush on the head of the house. She murdered like the whole family, his mother, his father, his wife, his children, and she got off. She went to trial and she got off. And a woman wrote to me, and she was related to the who owned a furniture store. And she sent me photos and she sent me all sorts of things. It's a fun connection when you connect to people like that. And she provided some information for me about the family too. So I love that part too, the hooking up and with readers. But if anybody wants some of my research, I am happy to share photos, research, because I really am a believer in that.
So how did that killer get off? Do you know?
Wait, which killer?
The one who killed the family, who got off, you said.
Because the jury felt sorry for her. You know, it's interesting. I did a whole book. It was called Murder in the Gilded Age. I think and it was about a woman who was raised in New Orleans and extremely beautiful. When she was like 15 and a half or 16, a man who was like the mayor of a city in, I'm going to say Kansas, I can't remember for sure now, married her. And he was like 55. I mean, she was younger than his children. I mean, she was a teenager. And she didn't really like being married to him. They weren't married very long. And she poisoned him. And she'd accidentally poisoned somebody else earlier, thinking the drink was for her husband, but another guy drank it. He survived. The jury found her not guilty, even though one of them was quoted as telling a newspaper reporter, "We thought she was guilty, but we didn't want to see her hang because she's too pretty." And then she went on to murder a couple other men and ended up living till she was like 90. So a lot of times there was, you know, if a woman was attractive, you know, it's kind of like the movie Chicago. You know, a lot of might get off because they were attractive, or the jury felt sorry for them, or whatever. With the housekeeper, the furniture owner was was piggish. And I don't mean that in terms of weight. I mean, just, he wasn't a pleasant person. And, but I mean, she was caught with the rat powder. She had the motive. She even talked about wanting to get rid of these children because he wouldn't marry her because he had his oldest daughter to take care of him. But they got off. I think it's online, but I can send you the chapter about it if you want to read it.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay, you gotta give me and that's something else I wanted to say. Janice knows this, but I write a blog called Shelf Life. And I would like—
I'm sorry, what's it called? What's it
Shelf
called?
Life. Shelf Life, like shelf, like where you put books, and then life. And I also write it for the Northwest Indiana Times too, but on my blog, if anybody wants to submit, you know, cover art and something about their book, I will post it for them. So,
Oh,
you know,
wow.
no charge
Thank
or
you.
anything. I did that for Janice, and maybe Janice can share more about that with you. But all you have to do is email me, and I can give you my email address, which is, if everybody's ready, Jane Ammeson, JaneAMM, like in Mary, S like in Sam, N like in Nancy, JaneAmmeson@gmail.com.
Thank you.
Please do, please do. I think, Janice, you can attest to that it's okay, right?
Yes, yes. It was very kind of you. Thank you.
Well, it's fun, and I'm all about writers supporting other writers. So, and again, if anybody wants information about any of the books, or about my research and links to the research, just let me know.
So what are you working on now?
I'm not working on any books right now. I'm just working on, I just got done covering the James Beard Awards, and I need to work on, get my posts out for that. I have a weekly food column, and I have assignments. I write a lot about food, like for Edible Michiana and the Northwest Indiana Times, and I write for a boating magazine. I just, for Ohio Magazine, Long Weekends. So I'm just like trying to keep up with assignments now, but and then Janice told me the bad news about IU not doing true crime anymore, which was disappointing, because I was thinking I want to do a true crime again. I love historic true crime.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. So that's what I'm doing right now, but I don't have a book in the works, and I miss that. I don't know if my husband misses it, but I do. My husband was a judge, So me writing about murders makes him a little nervous. But I-
Civil, was he a civil or criminal judge?
He was head judge in Berrien County, Michigan, and he did criminal cases. He also did war crimes over in Bosnia and Sarajevo, after in the early, well, around 2010 and that time. So I think, and then he worked for the UN. That was before we were married. But so
He needs to write a book.
on war crimes. I know.
Oh, wow.
Their whole system there is so different. And of course, the things that led to some of the atrocities there are still in existence, the different Albanians and the Serbs and the Croatians. So, but anyway. But please do email me in anything I can, help you with, or links to articles or whatever I can certainly do.
So do you, you subscribe to newspapers.com?
Yes, and newspaper archives and genealogical, trails. Yeah, it's deductible. And then, Indiana has the Hoosier Chronicles too. So, which is free. And so they have a lot of newspapers as well. And there are always more newspapers coming online all the time. The newspaper archive is nice because they have a lot of the small town Indiana newspapers. Like one of my favorite murderers was lived in Spencer County in Rockport. Married an older man after his wife died, maybe conveniently. She was their housekeeper. And then he died, maybe conveniently. Then her next husband died, and she went to trial. And so that was covered by, the Rockport papers, and the trial was sent over to the next county over. And so it was covered by that, Tell City, I think it was. So it's a fascinating story. And her house is still there, and I got to spend the night in it. It's been redone, and I thought, I wonder if it's haunted. But if it is, I didn't get to meet her. I mean, or any of the husbands. So not that I believe in ghosts, but late at night, sometimes you do, when you hear a creak or something. But the house is right on the river and was built in 1859. And it has the kind of cellars that are indicative that it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Really thick cellars. And it was right on, like I said, right on the river. And so many slaves were freedom seekers were escaping across the Ohio and then on their journey north. And I also wrote a book called Haunted Underground Railroad. And it's about talk about things that are hard to research. I mean, first of all, Underground Railroad sites were secretive by nature, but then also haunts. But, there's a Slippery Noodle in Indianapolis was an Underground Railroad site. And,
Yeah.
So it's just kind of fascinating. The dunes in Northwest Indiana were as well. So anyway, so, I don't know. Did I answer your question okay? I tend to.
Yeah, no, it's just fascinating.
So any more questions for me?
The lights are blinking. Anybody?
Oh, spirits.
You've answered, this is really fascinating. I gotta check out your books. And I'll get more information from Janice. I'm especially interested in some of the Lincoln and the Lincoln information.
It's fascinating. And I mean, when I first started researching Lincoln, I was doing a book with Mrs. Cook, not this one, but one on Holiday World, back probably in 2005. And I was amazed at all the Lincoln connections. And Indiana at the time, I'm not saying it was because of me, but I think because of writers like me, discovering that, hey, somebody pay attention to this. I mean, Lincoln was only in Kentucky until he was 7. And then, of course, he was in Illinois. But I mean, this is huge. And like I said, I have a family cookbook that we're people donating recipes. If you read history books, like, we're connected to Lincoln. And, so it's fascinating. And there was a guy, and I love this, named O.V. Brown. And back in the 1920s and 30s, he went around and shot photos of all these Lincoln places that had been around when Lincoln was alive. And a lot of them are gone now, but I have that archival, these photos, maybe 200 of them that somebody shared with me. And, people who do that, they're really contributing to history. And again, I'll share things, it doesn't do me any good to keep things locked up. I just think we should all share, because that's the best way to get history out.
You're right. That's true.
I have a question for you. Did you ever do any research about the Standard grocery store murder? There was a man who owned the Standard grocery stores in Indianapolis, and he died under mysterious circumstances. His widow went to go live on a house off of, I think, Spring Mill Road or one of those roads out there. And it was supposedly haunted because there were a lot. I think there were some like helter-skelter type people that came and broke into her home and murdered her.
Oh my, murdered his wife? Or
murdered his wife or whatnot. I don't remember all the specifics of the story, but I know it was tied to the Standard grocery stores.
Wow.
That used to be
The House of Blue Lights. Yeah.
I'm sorry,
yes, House of
It
Blue
was
Lights.
known
Yes.
as the House of Blue Lights.
Okay,
Yes.
Yes, there were some people she was quite elderly at that time, and some people really took advantage of her, and then eventually ended up being a murder. But she did inherit her fortune from the original Standard.
I'm not even familiar with Standard grocery stores. When did this take place? I don't think I have a murder that's past 1929. Except
the murder was in, I think, the early 70s. It was in that sort of same range, a little later than the Sylvia Likens thing.
Oh, that was horrible. Oh my God. Yeah. Whoa.
Yeah, there was a Standard grocery store in our neighborhood where I was growing up. It used to be off of 39th in Illinois. And I used to go there with my grandmother all the time when I was a little kid. So
really? Okay.
Yeah, so Standard was one of the, and I think they had one downtown. I think the original was downtown, as a matter of fact. And then he moved out and had something. They went under, basically. Yeah.
They just
they became because I ended up I did a trial for the company that acquired Standard food stores, and they eventually became I think they operated under a Payless name, and then they operated under Lowell's.
Growing up, our stores were Kroger and A&P, and then Stack and Dentel's was a big one. Yeah. I don't think there's A&P anymore either, is there?
No, there used to be A&P on College years and years ago.
Yeah. So, no, I never have. That's a little bit.
David Letterman used to work at A&P.
But that's interesting. I like even older murders. I like the 1800s. Yeah.
Claremont, I think, back in the 80s.
I'm sorry, what?
Sorry, we have a side conversation going on about.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. Another one that I'm still interested in is Susan Beaver. She had an affair with a prosperous, well-known married man in Marshall, Indiana, very cute town, and died as a result of a doctor attempting to restore her menses. We can't find out, even the Marshall Historical Society, which is fantastic. We can't find out where she's buried. And, it's just, she appears, she's murdered. It's a lot of newspaper articles, and then it goes away. and even the Historical Society didn't know that this very prestigious man back in the 1880s had been involved in this case. But then it just stops, which is interesting. Like, did he pay somebody off or what? And we've never been able to find out where she's buried. So there are all these mysteries that are still kind of surrounding. And there was one woman, she was Black, she was African-American, and her name was Liz Smith, which is an impossible name to research, but I was able to find some stuff out. And she was involved in the Bill Gunnis case. She one time was considered the most beautiful woman in northern Indiana, maybe even the whole state. Her parents had been slaves, and she had the secrets supposedly had the secrets to what had really happened to Bill Gunnis. But she also was quite the character. She was involved with a married lawyer. His house is still in LaPorte on the historic street, beautiful house. He was married with 3 kids. And she had quite the temper. And when he attempted to break up with her, he lost a judgeship over her and everything. Was quite the scandal. And of course, Indiana had this miscegenation laws up until the 1970s. So it wasn't like he could divorce his wife and marry her. She once supposedly held him upside down by his ankles over a balcony because she was so mad at him. And she would take a hatchet to the newspaper guy because she didn't like what he had written. She's a fascinating, compelling character. And she was very wise with her money. And when she died, she had all this money. Both her children had died, her parents had died, her husband had died. And I would love to find out more about her too. But when you type in Elizabeth Smith, you get a whole lot of, whole lot of hits. So, but I was lucky the LaPorte Historical Society has a fascinating and fantastic archival system too. But I mean, she had tons of money. She just was very wise and saved it. But she was supposed to tell the lawyer who represented some people in the Bill Gunnis case about what had really happened. And she was dying and she tried to contact him. He was gone fishing for a week. And when he got back, she was dead. So she had so much knowledge and it just disappeared. But I love knowing about these interesting characters. So here on the screen, I pulled this up only if you're ever outside of Chicago, this was a stop on the Underground Railroad. It was owned by a German. It was a mill. They've restored it. It's open to the public now. And this basement area here, total separate entranceway, kind of hidden. And as the freedom seekers were moving north, most likely into Canada, they would stay here too. I find these stories compelling too, because the courage it took to escape, those freedom, those people, vigilantes from Kentucky who were after the slaves and had all this power, and then the people willing to risk a lot, lose their property and stuff because of the Supreme Court decisions, who were willing to hide them. So anyway, that's a stop on my Lincoln thing. And Lincoln supposedly stayed here. It's beautiful. It's in Granville, Ohio. So anyway, I'm off track again. So any more questions?
All right.
No.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then we will call it a day.
And again, if you want something, if you want a link to the Collier article, whatever, just contact me. But make sure you send me information about your books too, okay?
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you,
Yes,
Janice.
you.
it's been great.
Take care. Bye-bye.
I loved it. So I will be in touch.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye. Oh, and send me
Bye.
the link and I'll post it on social media. So,
Okay, yes, we will definitely do that.
okay, take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Stop recording and then leave. Hopefully that will show up on the other side. It's not usually this bad, the technical,
Yeah.
what,
It's usually pretty good.
but